So can you tell me why Coca-Cola doesn't have a say in whether it sponsors the Genocide Olympics next year?
So what I stated was that we do not have a say in the selection of the host city, nor on whether an Olympics is postponed or relocated.
I mean, we're all waiting with bated breath for all of you to say, move the Olympics. The Beijing Genocide Olympics need to be moved. Can't you say that?
We don't make a decision on the host location, but we work on the human rights aspect, and there has been progress in this space.
For advertisers, the Olympic Games is the holy grail of marketing. For the IOC, it means billions of dollars as companies clamor to be part of the traditionally feel-good event. But these Beijing Olympics are different. Many companies are taking a low-key approach, balancing a fine line between their investment and anger around China's human rights record. For more on this, I'm joined by Dae-hee Kwok, a professor of sports marketing at the University of Michigan. Professor, we usually see a lot of splashy ad campaigns both leading up to and during the games, but they're very muted this year. Why?
The challenge here is the people in China, they have different information about what's going on in Xinjiang area. So that is putting sponsors in a very difficult situation to what do we do? Do we either boycott, or do we pull out, or do we just ignore what's going on? Which put a lot of pressure on sponsors. So staying muted might be the best course of action for now.
No major sponsor boycotted these games. Why do you think that is?
Sponsors are not independent from what's going on, and they have to really navigate through what do we do, and if there will be a potential backlash from Chinese market. So you don't want to upset the Chinese market for sure, because if we learn from the past, there has been a retaliation from the Chinese government as well as Chinese consumers.
Are advertisers willing, do you think, to risk alienating their Western customers in exchange for accessing the massive Chinese market?
That's what's going on with Coca-Cola, just for instance, in the domestic market. So they focus on rather host city, for instance, because it's a celebration in China right now, with the Beijing being the first time hosting the Olympics, and the Coca-Cola is doing a lot of activations in China. Getting Chinese market involved with the Olympics, I think this would be a great opportunity because they are the hosting nation of the Olympics. So it's unfortunate that this the current climate and what's going on, just not allowing this companies to openly or really celebrating these Olympics in both the home market as well as in Chinese market.
Usually around the games, we see ads that kind of play off the culture of the host nation, but not really this time. Why do you think that is?
I think the advertisements are trying to portray why people stick with the Olympics or why people tune into the Olympics.
Will advertisers face any blowback in the West for their association with these games?
You will have some glitches here and there with what are you doing? Why are you so silent? But the brands will move on, and the Beijing Olympic is not the entire marketing platform that they rely on. So I think it's more of a PR issue from the Western media standpoint. But if you look at Chinese market, it can really hurt the bottom line of the business. So if we boycott or if we take a stance, and that's what the corporations would fear more about.
In North America, one of the leading critics of corporations linked to these Olympics has been Sophie Richardson of Human Rights Watch. We reached her in Washington. Sophie, you wrote a letter to the top Olympic sponsors asking what kind of diligence they did around China's human rights record. Tell us about the letter and what kind of response did you get?
Sure. It's now been almost a year, actually, since we wrote to these top tier sponsors of these particular games. And we asked them really a very simple question. What human rights due diligence had they done around their sponsorship of these games? Meaning, had they asked themselves questions about reputational risk? Were they sure that their supply chains are free of problems with respect to forced labor? These are all standard affirmative responsibilities companies are meant to fulfill under a set of United Nations guiding principles. And the fact that none of them really gave us an even remotely meaningful reply, I think, can be taken to mean that either they didn't do that kind of homework or they're not going to talk about it.
Sophie, what are governments doing to make companies more accountable for doing business in China?
There is now binding legislation here in the United States, and that other governments, including the European Union, are considering that will require companies importing goods, at least from Xinjiang, the Uyghur region, to show that they're not made using forced labor. Because these voluntary standards that companies have been asked for years to fulfill haven't really worked.
As you pointed out, companies have been remiss to talk about their Olympic involvement. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think they're trying to make sure that they don't get caught in the crossfire, essentially, between two different sets of standards, right? And the Chinese government has not been shy about punishing foreign companies they perceive as being critical of their human rights record, particularly around Xinjiang, for example. When externally companies are increasingly under pressure, including now by way of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US, not running afoul of that legislation. And these two things really do pull in different directions, and increasingly companies are going to have to make a choice about, how they're going to do business.
Sophie, many of the companies, including Coke and Intel, were called before Congress and grilled on their involvement in these Olympics. They basically said this doesn't lessen their commitments to human rights. And by the way, we don't choose the host. Can they have it both ways?
Well, there's nothing written in stone saying they have to sponsor Olympics, for starters. Many of these companies hold themselves out as being great defenders, of ESG rights or human rights. Coke recently was very visible in a discussion here in the US, expressing concerns about voting rights, which is great. Why doesn't it have anything to say about the fact that 1 billion people across China don't ever get to vote?
You can catch the breakdown every night at 8 p.m. Eastern on CBC Sports' YouTube channel. You can take us with you on the CBC Sports app or watch us anytime at cbc.ca/sports. For CBC Sports, I'm Jamie Strachan.